The city never slept, but for Smith, it merely hummed with a heavy, rhythmic indifference. At 65 years old, the world had become a blur of flickering fluorescent lights and a sharp, metallic scent of industrial-grade floor wax. Smith moved with a slow, practiced deliberation through the cavernous halls of the central subway station. Each push of his heavy mop was a testament to a body that had long passed its expiration date for manual labor, yet his grip remained firm. His back was a map of old aches, and his hands were permanently stained with the grime of 1,000 midnight shifts, but he did not falter. He couldn't afford to. For the past 7 years, the janitor's closet had been his sanctuary and his armory. Inside, amidst the chemical fumes and the rattling buckets, he transformed from a tired old man into a provider, a protector, and a silent hero. Every bead of sweat that dripped onto the cold linoleum was an investment in a future he would never see. It was an investment in Jason. Jason was 10 years old now, a bright-eyed boy with a laugh that could pierce through the thickest city fog. To the rest of the world, Smith was just a shadow in a blue jumpsuit, a ghost cleaning up the debris of other people's lives. But to Jason, Smith was the world. And to Smith, Jason was the only thing keeping his heart beating in a world that had stolen everything else. The grief was always there, tucked away in the corner of his mind like a persistent shadow. 7 years ago, the news had come like a physical blow, a construction accident in a far-off province. A collapsed crane, a pile of twisted rebar, and no survivors. Peter, Smith's only son and Jason's father, was gone. Smith remembered the funeral, a small, somber affair where he had stood over a closed casket, clutching a 3-year-old Jason's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had promised the boy then, in the silence of the cemetery, that he would never want for anything. He had promised to give Jason the best of everything, a vow that seemed impossible for a man who made his living emptying trash cans and scrubbing subway tiles. Yet, somehow he had done it. Smith lived on a diet of stale bread and black coffee, wearing the same frayed coat for a decade so that Jason could have new sneakers for the start of school. He worked double shifts, sometimes staying in the tunnels for 20 hours at a time, just to ensure Jason had a tutor for his mathematics or a fresh suit for his school concerts. He never let the boy see the exhaustion that clouded his eyes or the way his knees trembled when he climbed the stairs to their cramped, fourth-floor apartment. In the mornings, the routine was sacred. Smith would return from the night shift just as the sun began to bleed through the city skyline. He would wash the smell of bleach from his skin, his hands shaking slightly under the cold tap, and then he would wake Jason with a gentle shake of the shoulder. He would cook a breakfast he wouldn't eat himself, watching with a quiet, fierce pride as the boy devoured his eggs and toast. "Did you finish your history essay, Jason?" Smith would ask, his voice raspy from the night's silence. "Yes, Grandpa. I think I got an A," Jason would reply, his mouth full. "Good. Education is the only way out of these tunnels, son. You study hard, and I'll handle the rest." After breakfast, Smith would walk Jason to the edge of the school grounds. It was a modest school, but Smith had pulled every favor and worked every holiday to ensure Jason was enrolled in one of the better districts. As they walked, Smith noticed the subtle changes in the boy. Jason used to chatter incessantly about superheroes and space travel, but lately, he had grown introspective. His eyes, once wide with childhood curiosity, now seemed to linger on the dark corners of the streets they passed. At the school gate, Jason stopped. He didn't run inside to join the other children. Instead, he stood for a moment, his backpack looking too heavy for his small frame. He glanced toward an alleyway across the street, a narrow, sunless gap between two crumbling brick buildings, and then looked back at Smith with an expression that bordered on terror. "Is everything okay, Jason?" Smith asked, reaching out a calloused hand to brush a stray hair from the boy's forehead. Jason flinched. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to Smith, it felt like a seismic shift. "I'm fine, Grandpa," Jason whispered. His voice lacked its usual chime. He looked down at his shoes, the new sneakers Smith had nearly killed himself to buy. I have a lot of homework. You can tell me anything, Jason. You know that, right?" Jason nodded, but he didn't meet Smith's eyes. "I know, but I promised I wouldn't tell. It's a secret. If I tell, things will get bad." "Bad for who?" Jason didn't answer. He turned and ran toward the school entrance, his small figure quickly swallowed by the sea of uniforms. Smith stood there for a long time, the morning air feeling colder than it should. The city hummed around him, cars honking and commuters rushing past, but all Smith could hear was the echo of Jason's voice. "If I tell, things will get bad." Smith's instincts, sharpened by decades of navigating the unforgiving landscape of the working class, began to prickle. He knew the look of a child hiding something, but this wasn't the innocent secrecy of a broken window or a failed test. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of fear. Throughout his shift that evening, Smith found himself unable to focus. The rhythm of his mop was broken. He stared at the subway tracks, imagining the dark alley Jason had looked at. Who was waiting there? A bully? A stranger? The thought of someone threatening his grandson, the only light left in his life, sent a surge of adrenaline through his tired veins. He had spent 7 years mourning Peter, convinced that he was the only one left to guard the boy. He had built a fortress of labor and sacrifice around Jason, believing that as long as he worked hard enough, the world couldn't reach in and hurt him. But as he scrubbed a stubborn stain off the platform, a terrifying realization dawned on him. You could build a fortress, but the most dangerous threats often found a way to slip through the cracks of the very gate you were trying to protect. Smith decided then. He wouldn't wait for Jason to find the courage to speak. Tomorrow, he would leave the tunnels early. He would be there before the final bell rang. He would watch from the shadows, just as he had lived in the shadows for 7 years. He would find out who was casting a pall over his grandson's life, and he would do whatever was necessary to end it. He didn't know yet that the ghost he was chasing wasn't a stranger. He didn't know that the foundation of his 7-year sacrifice was about to crumble into dust. All he knew was that Jason was afraid, and for a man like Smith, that was enough to turn a janitor back into a soldier. He gripped the handle of his mop until his knuckles ached, staring into the dark mouth of the subway tunnel, waiting for the dawn to bring a truth he was nowhere near ready to face. The following afternoon, the air felt thick with a humidity that seemed to cling to the soot-stained brickwork of the city. Smith did not wait for his shift to end. For the first time in 7 years of impeccable service, he walked away from his station 2 hours early, leaving his mop bucket and cart tucked into the shadows of the janitor's closet. His heart pounded against his ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm, a drumbeat of anxiety that drowned out the screeching brakes of the arriving trains. He moved through the streets with a singular focus, his old boots heavy on the cracked pavement, as he made his way toward Jason's school. He did not approach the main gate where the parents and nannies gathered in a chaotic, chattering throng. Instead, he circled around the back, utilizing the tactical instincts of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the periphery of society. He found a vantage point behind a rusted green dumpster, positioned perfectly so he could see the mouth of the alleyway Jason had looked at with such terror the morning before. Smith checked his worn watch. The final bell rang, and a few moments later, a flood of children erupted from the school doors. They were a kaleidoscope of motion and sound, but Smith's eyes were calibrated only for one boy. He saw Jason emerge, walking with his head down, his backpack seemingly heavier than it had been that morning. Jason did not linger to talk to his classmates. He bypassed the usual route home and walked straight toward the narrow, sunless gap between the two crumbling apartment buildings across the street. Smith felt a cold chill settle into his marrow. He stayed low, moving with a silent grace that his aging joints shouldn't have possessed. As he watched, a man stepped out from the deepest shadows of the alley. This man was not a disheveled predator or a common street thug. He wore an expensive, tailored jacket that looked entirely out of place in this neighborhood, and his posture was one of relaxed, arrogant authority. Smith's breath hitched. From this distance, he couldn't see the man's face clearly, but the silhouette triggered a flicker of recognition so faint it felt like a ghost touching his mind. He watched as Jason stopped a few feet away from the stranger. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled ball of bills, the lunch money Smith had meticulously set aside that morning, and handed it over. The stranger leaned down, his voice a low murmur that Smith couldn't quite catch over the distant roar of a passing bus. He saw the man place a hand on Jason's shoulder, and even from 20 yards away, Smith could see the boy shudder. The man was speaking with a forced, terrifying intimacy. He leaned in closer, his lips near Jason's ear, and though Smith couldn't hear the words, he saw the boy's eyes widen in a look of absolute, paralyzed fear. The stranger reached into a small bag he was carrying and handed Jason a chocolate bar, a cheap bribe to soften the blow of whatever threats he had just issued. Jason took it with shaking hands, looking as though he might vomit. The man patting the boy's cheek with a patronizing flick of his fingers before melting back into the darkness of the alley. Jason stood frozen for a long minute, staring at the space where the man had been, before turning to walk slowly back toward their apartment. Smith didn't follow the boy. His gaze remained fixed on the alley. The protective rage he had felt earlier had transformed into something sharper and far more dangerous. He realized that this was not a simple case of bullying. This was a system. Someone was grooming his grandson, utilizing fear to extract the very little they possessed, and doing so with a calculated cruelty that suggested they knew exactly how much Jason loved his grandfather. He stepped out from behind the dumpster, his jaw set in a hard line. He was 65 years old, a janitor who had spent the last 7 years mourning a son and sacrificing his own health for a child's future. He had believed that the greatest threats were the hunger and the cold of the city. He had been wrong. The greatest threat was the secret that had walked into his grandson's life and taken up residence in the shadows. Smith began to walk toward the alleyway, his hands curling into fists. He remembered the promise he had made at the closed casket of his son, that Jason would have the best of everything. That promise now meant more than just food and clothes. It meant safety. It meant the removal of whatever parasite was feeding on the boy's innocence. As he stepped into the mouth of the alley, the temperature seemed to drop. The walls were slick with condensation and covered in layers of faded graffiti. He didn't see the man anymore, but he could smell the lingering scent of expensive cologne and cigarette smoke, a smell that belonged in a high-rise office, not a derelict corridor. "I know you're here," Smith called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls with a raspy, commanding strength he hadn't used in years. "I know what you're doing to that boy." Silence was his only answer. He moved deeper into the gloom, his eyes scanning the alcoves and the piles of discarded crates. He found a discarded candy wrapper, the same brand the man had just given Jason, and crushed it under his boot. The person he was looking for was gone, but the presence of the stranger remained like a stain on the air. Smith realized Jason's words from the morning before were a warning not just for the boy, but for him. "If I tell, things will get bad." The stranger was using Smith as a weapon against Jason, threatening the boy with the grandfather's potential suffering or departure. It was a classic psychological trap, designed to keep a child silent by making them feel responsible for the safety of the adult they loved most. The janitor stood in the middle of the alley, staring up at the narrow strip of gray sky far above. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had worked himself to the bone, convinced that he was providing Jason with a fortress, but he had left the front gate unguarded. He had been so focused on the material needs of the boy that he had missed the emotional siege happening right under his nose. He walked back out into the sunlight, his mind churning. He couldn't go home yet. He needed to think. He couldn't simply confront Jason, because the boy was clearly too terrified to break his promise. He needed more information. He needed to identify the man in the expensive jacket. As he walked, Smith began to piece together the fragments of the encounter. The man's familiarity with Jason's schedule, the way he moved in the shadows, the expensive clothes, it all suggested someone who had been watching them for a long time. It suggested a predator who understood the exact contours of their small, isolated world. Smith decided that he would return to the school every day. He would watch and wait. He would document every meeting, and when the time was right, he would strike. He was no longer just a man with a mop. He was a guardian with a mission. The city continued its indifferent hum, but for Smith, the world had narrowed down to a single alleyway and a stranger who had made the mistake of underestimating an old man with nothing left to lose but a 10-year-old boy. He would find the truth, even if it meant digging through the very grime he spent his nights cleaning away. He didn't know yet that the truth would be far more devastating than any lie he had imagined. The days that followed were a blur of cold calculation and silent surveillance. Smith returned to his night shifts at the subway station, but his mind was no longer on the rhythmic arc of his mop or the gray water swirling in his bucket. He moved like a ghost through the tunnels, his eyes constantly scanning the dark openings of the service vents and the long, echoing shadows of the platforms. He saw threats everywhere now, in the flicker of a faulty light, in the sudden movement of a rat across the tracks, in the distant, muffled laughter of late-night commuters. Every shadow was a potential hiding place for the man in the expensive jacket. During the day, Smith barely slept. He would return home, wash the grime from his hands until his skin was raw, and then sit by the window, watching Jason. He watched the way the boy ate his breakfast with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. He watched the way Jason's eyes darted toward the front door every time the floorboards creaked in the hallway. The bond between them, once built on a foundation of easy trust and shared dreams, now felt strained, pulled taut by the invisible weight of the secret Jason was carrying. Smith stuck to his plan. Every afternoon, he left the station early, sacrificing his meager wages for the chance to stand in the shadows behind the rusted green dumpster. He became a fixture of the alley's periphery, as silent and unnoticed as the soot on the walls. He watched the meetings occur with a sickening regularity. Each time, Jason would hand over a small wad of cash, and each time, the stranger would whisper into the boy's ear, his hand heavy and possessive on Jason's shoulder. Smith began to notice details he had missed before. The stranger had a specific way of walking, a slight, confident swagger that suggested he felt entirely untouchable. He wore a heavy gold ring on his right hand that glinted even in the dim light of the alley. More importantly, Smith realized the man always arrived and departed from the same direction, disappearing into the maze of backstreets that led toward the wealthier district uptown. On the third day, Smith decided he could no longer remain a passive observer. The sight of Jason's trembling hands as he surrendered his lunch money was a needle in Smith's heart. He needed to know who this man was, and he needed to know what hold he had over his grandson. He waited until the meeting ended and Jason began his slow trek home. Instead of following the boy, Smith waited for the stranger to move. The man in the expensive jacket stepped out of the alley, lighting a cigarette with a silver lighter that hissed in the quiet air. He started walking north, his pace brisk and untroubled. Smith followed, staying half a block behind, blending into the crowds of workers and shoppers. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent a lifetime being overlooked, his drab blue jumpsuit the perfect camouflage against the gray concrete of the city. The chase led them through a series of increasingly affluent streets. The crumbling brickwork of the tenements gave way to polished brownstones and gated courtyards. The air grew cleaner, the noise of the city muffled by the presence of manicured trees and expensive cars. The stranger finally stopped in front of a modern glass and steel apartment complex, a building that screamed of wealth and exclusivity. He nodded to the doorman, who greeted him with a respectful tip of his cap, and disappeared inside. Smith stood across the street, his heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at his own hands, calloused, stained, and shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. The gap between his world and the world this man inhabited was an abyss. Yet this stranger was reaching across that void to prey on a 10-year-old boy and a 65-year-old janitor. Why? What could a man living in a glass tower possibly want from a child who lived in a fourth-floor walk-up? He waited near the building for an hour, hoping the man would emerge so he could get a closer look at his face. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, a black car pulled up to the curb. The stranger walked out of the building, now wearing a different, even more expensive coat. He stepped into the back of the car, and for a fleeting second, the interior light illuminated his profile. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Smith felt the air leave his lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The man's face, the high cheekbones, the straight bridge of the nose, the specific curve of the jaw. It was a face Smith had seen every day of his life in the mirror. It was a face he had buried 7 years ago. It was Peter. Smith staggered back, his knees hitting the cold pavement. He gripped the edge of a stone planter, his breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs. It couldn't be. Peter was dead. He had stood at the casket. He had seen the police reports. He had lived through 7 years of agonizing grief, fueled by the absolute certainty that his son was gone. But the eyes, he could never forget those eyes. They were the same eyes that had looked at him with childhood wonder, the same eyes that had promised to take care of the family, the same eyes that were now cold and predatory as they looked down at a 10-year-old boy in a sunless alley. The black car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the glittering lights of the uptown traffic. Smith remained on the ground, the cold of the stone seeping into his bones. The foundation of his life, every double shift, every sacrificed meal, every promise he had made to Jason, was built on a lie so profound it made his head spin. Peter wasn't a victim of a construction accident. He was a ghost who had chosen to haunt his own family. He had let his father believe he was dead so he could escape the burdens of his life. And now he had returned to bleed the very people who had mourned him. He was using Jason as a piggy bank and Smith as a tool of terror, threatening the boy with a secret that was actually the father's own existence. Smith stood up slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical. The rage he had felt before was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. He realized that the bad things Jason feared weren't external threats from a stranger. The bad thing was the truth. Jason had been told his father was alive, but he had also been told that if he revealed it, his grandfather would be destroyed, either by the shock or by the legal consequences of Peter's death. The janitor began the long walk back to his neighborhood. He didn't see the city anymore. He saw only the twisted rebar of his own memories. He thought of the 7 years of labor he had given to a ghost. He thought of the tears he had wiped from Jason's face, comfort given for a loss that never happened. He realized that his son had sacrificed Jason's childhood and Smith's old age on the altar of his own selfish freedom. As he approached his apartment, Smith saw the light in Jason's bedroom window. He knew what he had to do. The time for surveillance was over. The ghost had been identified, and now it was time for the janitor to sweep away the most dangerous filth he had ever encountered. He would confront the dead, and he would do it for the boy who was still very much alive. Smith climbed the stairs, each step a vow of vengeance. He was no longer just a grandfather. He was the judge, and the trial was about to begin. Smith climbed the final flight of stairs to their apartment, his movements no longer heavy with exhaustion, but fueled by a cold, vibrating fury. Each step was a strike against the floorboards, a physical manifestation of the 7 years of lies he had carried on his back. He reached their door and paused, his hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. Inside was Jason, the boy who had been burdened with a secret too heavy for any man, let alone a child. And out there, in the glittering glass towers of the wealthy district, was a ghost who had stolen 7 years of their lives. He pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet, filled with the soft, yellow glow of a single desk lamp where Jason was ostensibly doing his homework. The boy looked up, his eyes widening as he saw his grandfather's face. Smith hadn't washed the subway grime away this time. He looked raw, his eyes bloodshot, and his jaw set like stone. "Grandpa, you're home early," Jason whispered, his voice small and full of the familiar, guarded dread. Smith didn't answer immediately. He walked to the small wooden kitchen table, the table where he had sat every morning, counting pennies to make sure Jason had a future, and pulled out a chair. He sat down and gestured for Jason to join him. "Jason," Smith said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I went for a walk today. I went uptown." The boy's face drained of color. He sat on the edge of the opposite chair, his small hands gripped together so tightly the skin was white. He didn't speak. He didn't even seem to breathe. "I saw him, Jason. I saw the man in the alley. The man who takes your lunch money. The man who tells you that if you speak to me, everything will fall apart." Smith leaned forward, his eyes locked onto his grandson's. "I know who he is." A single tear escaped Jason's eye and rolled down his cheek. He let out a choked, broken sob. "He said you'd be sick, Grandpa. He said the police would take you away because we told them he was dead. He said it was my fault he had to hide." Smith felt a surge of hatred so sharp it nearly choked him. Peter hadn't just abandoned them. He had weaponized the boy's love for his grandfather. He had turned Smith into a threat to keep Jason silent. "He lied to you, Jason," Smith said, his voice softening but remaining firm. "He lied to me for 7 years, and he's been lying to you every day in that alley." "But he's my dad," Jason cried, the words finally breaking through the wall of secrecy. "He said he was working on a big secret project, and he'd come back for us soon if I just gave him enough money to finish." Smith closed his eyes for a moment, the cruelty of it almost unbearable. Peter was living in a luxury high-rise, wearing tailored coats and driving in black cars, while he extorted lunch money from his own son under the guise of a secret project. The following morning, Smith did not go to the janitor's closet. He waited. He watched Jason walk toward school, but this time, he followed openly. When the afternoon bell rang and the crowds of children dispersed, Smith didn't hide behind the dumpster. He stood at the very mouth of the alleyway, a tall, gaunt figure in a faded blue jumpsuit, waiting for the dead to arrive. He didn't have to wait long. Peter stepped out from the shadows of the back street, lighting a cigarette with that same silver lighter. He was smiling, the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he was invisible to the consequences of his actions. He saw Jason approaching and began to lean forward, reaching out that hand with the heavy gold ring. Then he saw Smith. Peter froze. The cigarette dropped from his lips, sparks scattering on the damp pavement. For a long, agonizing minute, the father and the son stared at each other across the grime of the alley. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, indifferent hum of the city. Smith walked forward. His boots crunched on the gravel, each step a deliberate reclamation of the 7 years he had lost. Jason stood between them, trembling, looking back and forth between the grandfather who had raised him and the father who had haunted him. "Hello, Peter," Smith said. His voice was devoid of warmth, devoid of grief. It was the voice of a man who had spent his life cleaning up filth and had finally found the source of the rot. Peter's face shifted. The shock vanished, replaced by a cold, defensive mask. He straightened his expensive jacket and looked at his father with a sneer that didn't quite hide the flicker of panic in his eyes. "You weren't supposed to find out, old man," Peter said. His voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of the wealthy district, not the subway tunnels. It was better for everyone this way. You got to be the hero, the noble martyr. And I got to be free. Free. Smith spat the word like it was poison. You left your son to grow up believing his father was a pile of ash. You let me work 20-hour shifts in the dark so you could live in a glass tower. And then you came back to steal the lunch money out of a 10-year-old's pocket? Peter shrugged, a casual, elegant movement. I needed liquidity. My investments, they take time. I knew you'd have a little stashed away. You were always good at hoarding pennies. Smith looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the boy he had taught to ride a bike. This wasn't the man who had promised to honor the family name. This was a parasite. Peter had faked his death not because of a tragedy, but because he was bored of being a father, bored of being a son, and bored of being poor. He had utilized the construction accident as a convenient exit, leaving the wreckage for Smith to clear. You're not dead, Peter, Smith said, stepping closer until he could smell the expensive cologne and the cowardice. But you're a ghost to us now. Peter laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. And what are you going to do? Call the cops? Tell them the man who died 7 years ago is standing in an alley? You'll be the one they investigate, Dad. Fraud? Insurance money. You took that small payout, didn't you? You think they won't wonder if you were in on it? Smith didn't flinch. He thought of the small insurance check he had used to pay for the funeral and Jason's first pair of glasses. He realized then that Peter had calculated even that. He had made Smith an unwitting accomplice to ensure his silence. Smith looked down at Jason, who was watching them with wide, shattered eyes. The boy was seeing the hero father he had imagined turn into a monster in real time. Smith reached out and took Jason's hand. His own hand was rough, calloused, and stained with the dirt of the city, but it was real. It was honest. I don't care about the money, Peter, Smith said. And I don't care about the towers you live in. But you are done with this boy. You will never speak to him again. You will never come to this neighborhood again. Peter stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Or what? You're an old man with a mop. I have resources. I can make your life very difficult. Smith looked at his son and felt a profound sense of pity. Peter still thought this was about power, about who had more resources. He didn't understand that a man who has already lived through his own death has nothing left to fear. I've spent 7 years in the dark, cleaning up after people like you, Smith said quietly. I know how to make things disappear, Peter. I know where the city hides its secrets. If you ever touch this boy again, I won't call the police. I'll just be the father you thought I was. The threat hung in the air, cold and immovable. For the first time, Peter's mask truly cracked. He saw the iron in his father's eyes, the strength of a man who had been forged in the tunnels and tempered by sacrifice. Peter backed away, his swagger gone, replaced by a frantic, stumbling retreat. He turned and fled toward the wealthy district, a ghost running back into the shadows of his own making. Smith stood in the alley, clutching Jason's hand. He felt the weight of the 7 years lift, only to be replaced by the heavy reality of the future. The fortress was broken, but for the first time, the gate was truly guarded. He looked down at Jason and saw the boy's shoulders drop as the secret finally left him. "Let's go home, Jason," Smith said. "We have a lot of work to do." They walked out of the alley together, leaving the ghost behind. Smith knew the battle wasn't over. There would be legal messes, questions, and the long, slow process of healing a child's heart. But as they walked toward their fourth-floor apartment, Smith didn't feel like a janitor. He felt like a man who had finally finished the longest shift of his life. He had spent 7 years cleaning up a lie. Now, it was time to start building the truth. The aftermath of the confrontation in the alley hung over the small apartment like a thick, suffocating fog. Smith sat at the kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of use, staring at his hands. For 7 years, these hands had scrubbed, lifted, and toiled for a ghost. He looked at the deep lines etched into his palms, filled with the permanent gray dust of the subway tunnels, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ever fix. Across from him, Jason sat silently, a half-eaten sandwich abandoned on a chipped plate. The boy looked smaller than he had only a few days ago, his shoulders hunched as if he were still bracing for a blow that had already landed. The truth had set them free, but it had also demolished the only world Jason had ever known. The heroic image of Peter, the hard-working father who had died in a tragic accident, had been replaced by the reality of a predator in a tailored coat. Smith knew that the healing would take years, and as he looked at his grandson, he felt a fresh wave of protective fury. Peter had not just stolen Smith's golden years. He had poisoned Jason's innocence, turning the boy's own love into a cage of fear and secrets. "He's not coming back, Grandpa," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. It wasn't a question, but a plea for reassurance. "No, Jason," Smith said, his voice as steady as the steel tracks he spent his nights maintaining. "He is gone. Truly gone this time. I have made sure of it." But Smith knew that making sure required more than just a threat in a dark alley. He spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. He returned to the subway station for his shifts, but he no longer felt like a ghost. He was a man with a target. He used his breaks to visit the dark corners of the station where the city's information brokers, the homeless, the runaway teens, the veteran panhandlers, congregated. Smith had spent 7 years being invisible to these people, but he had also spent 7 years observing them. He knew who saw everything. With a few crumpled bills and the quiet authority of a man who belonged to the tunnels, Smith began to gather intelligence. He didn't just want to keep Peter away. He wanted to understand the depth of the rot. He learned that Peter hadn't just been investing uptown. He was a man drowning in a different kind of grime, gambling debts, failed scams, and associations with people far more dangerous than a janitor with a mop. Peter's extortion of Jason hadn't just been greed, it had been desperation. This realization made Smith even more resolute. He contacted the small insurance company that had issued the payout after Peter's death. It was a terrifying move. Peter's threat about fraud wasn't entirely empty. Smith had used that money to survive, to bury an empty casket, and to provide for a child. By coming forward, Smith was stepping into a storm that could easily swallow him. He spent an afternoon in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office, speaking to an investigator whose eyes were as cold as the subway tiles. Smith told the truth, the whole, ugly truth. He handed over the details of the apartment complex where he had tracked Peter and the license plate of the black car. "You realize this could lead to charges against you as well, Mr. Smith?" the investigator asked, tapping a pen against a thick file. Smith looked at the man, his gaze unwavering. "I have spent 7 years working 20-hour shifts in the dark to pay back a debt I didn't even know was a lie. If the price of protecting my grandson is a prison cell, then at least I'll be able to sleep knowing he's safe." The investigator paused, the cynicism in his expression flickering for a brief second. He looked at Smith's calloused, stained hands and the faded blue jumpsuit that served as his only armor. "We'll look into it," was all he said. When Smith returned home that evening, he found Jason waiting by the door. The boy held a small, weathered photograph, the only one they had of Peter from before the accident. Jason looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Smith. Without a word, the boy walked to the trash can and dropped the photo inside. It was a silent act of closure, a final rejection of the ghost that had haunted them. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings and police statements. The ghost was eventually found. Peter had tried to run, but a man who builds his life on shadows is easily lost when the lights are turned on. He was arrested not just for the insurance fraud, but for a string of financial crimes that had finally caught up to him. Smith didn't go to the hearing. He didn't want to see the sneer on Peter's face or hear the polished, cultured voice that had once belonged to his son. He chose instead to take Jason to the park. They sat on a bench in the sun, away from the tunnels and the alleys. For the first time in years, Smith felt the warmth of the light on his skin without the gnawing guilt of a shift he should be working. He watched Jason play with a group of other children, not as a boy carrying a secret, but as a child who was finally allowed to be a child. Smith realized that the best of everything he had promised Jason wasn't about sneakers or suits or mathematics tutors. It was about the truth. It was about the strength to stand up when the world tries to bury you. He looked at his hands, still stained, still aching, but no longer shaking. He was still a janitor, and he likely always would be. He would still return to the dark tunnels of the subway, and he would still scrub the grime of the city. But the weight on his back was gone. As the sun began to set, Jason ran back to the bench, his face flushed and a genuine smile lighting up his eyes. "Can we go get some ice cream, Grandpa? I saved some of the money you gave me for the bus." Smith stood up, his joints creaking, but his heart felt light. He reached out and took Jason's hand, a hand that was no longer surrendering lunch money in a sunless alley, but reaching for a future built on a solid foundation. "No, Jason," Smith said, a rare, gruff warmth in his voice. "Keep your bus money. This one is on me. I think we've both earned a little sweetness." They walked out of the park together, two survivors of a 7-year storm, heading toward a home that was finally, truly, their own. The city hummed around them, indifferent as ever, but for the first time, Smith didn't mind the noise. He had cleaned up the greatest mess of his life, and now, finally, the air was clear. The legal gears of the city turned slowly, but for Smith, the pace felt like a countdown to a freedom he wasn't sure he knew how to inhabit. While Peter sat in a holding cell awaiting trial for grand larceny and insurance fraud, Smith found himself navigating a different kind of labyrinth. The investigators from the insurance firm had returned several times, their initial suspicion replaced by a grim respect for the man who had worked 7 years in the darkness to support a child's life. They had reached a tentative agreement. Smith's testimony against Peter would be a primary factor in mitigating his own legal culpability for the accidental payout he had unwittingly spent on Jason's upbringing. Despite the looming resolution, the apartment felt strange. The secret was gone, but the space it left behind was hollow and echoic. Smith continued to go to the subway station for his midnight shifts, not because he was still a slave to the debt, but because the rhythm of the mop was the only thing that kept his thoughts from spiraling into the what-ifs of the past 7 years. He scrubbed the platforms with a new kind of intensity, as if he could physically wash away the memory of his son's betrayal. One Tuesday morning, after returning from a particularly grueling shift, Smith found Jason sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of old newspapers. The boy had been quiet, retreating into books and drawing, but today he looked focused. He was cutting out articles. "What are you doing, Jason?" Smith asked, his voice thick with the fatigue of the tunnels. Jason didn't look up. "I'm looking for the stories, Grandpa. The ones about the construction accident 7 years ago." Smith felt a sharp pang in his chest. He sat down heavily, the smell of bleach still clinging to his jumpsuit. "Why, son? That's all buried now. We know it was a lie." "I know," Jason said, finally looking up. His eyes were no longer shadowed by the fear of the alley, but they carried a weight that no 10-year-old should possess. "But I want to see what people thought. I want to see if anyone else was hurt because he decided to disappear." Smith realized then that the healing process wasn't just about removing the predator. It was about understanding the wreckage left behind. He spent the next few hours helping Jason sift through the digital archives at the local library. They found the original reports. There had been no other casualties in the accident that Peter had used as his exit strategy. It had been a minor equipment failure, a small fire that had caused no injuries. But Peter had seized the moment of chaos to vanish, leaving behind a charred jacket and a stolen identity. The realization that Peter had manufactured a tragedy where none existed was a final, cold confirmation of his character. He hadn't just abandoned his family. He had orchestrated a trauma for them to live through. Smith watched Jason read the articles, seeing the boy's jaw set in a way that reminded him of his own reflection. Jason was learning the hardest lesson a child could learn, that blood does not always mean loyalty, and that some people are capable of profound cruelty for the sake of their own comfort. In the weeks leading up to the final court appearance, Smith focused on the best of everything in a new way. He didn't work extra shifts for expensive sneakers anymore. Instead, he used his time to take Jason to the museum, to the public library, and to the small community garden 3 blocks away. They spent hours planting tomatoes and marigolds in a small patch of earth, their hands side by side in the dirt. It was the first time Smith had worked with his hands on something that was meant to grow, rather than something that was meant to be cleaned. "Does it feel different, Grandpa?" Jason asked one afternoon, his hands covered in soil, not having to hide things. Smith looked at his grandson, the sunlight catching the gray in his own hair. "It feels like I can finally breathe the air, Jason. For 7 years, I felt like I was still down in those subway tunnels even when I was standing in the sun. Now the sun is just the sun." The tension began to ebb, replaced by a quiet, resilient hope. But the city had one more test for Smith. A week before the trial, a letter arrived at the apartment. It wasn't from the lawyers or the insurance firm. It was a handwritten note on expensive stationery, smuggled out of the detention center. "Dad, I'm scared. They're going to send me away for a long time. Jason needs a father, not a janitor. If you drop the testimony, I can fix this. I have money stashed away that they haven't found yet. We can move away, just the 3 of us. You don't have to work in the dirt anymore. Think about the boy." Smith read the letter twice. The manipulation was so blatant, the arrogance so thick, it made his stomach turn. Peter was still trying to use Jason as a bargaining chip, still trying to buy Smith's integrity with the very resources he had stolen. Smith didn't show the letter to Jason. He didn't need to. The boy had already made his choice when he dropped that photograph into the trash. Smith walked to the radiator in the corner of the kitchen. He struck a match and watched the expensive paper curl into black ash. He realized that Peter still didn't understand. This wasn't about fixing things or moving away. It was about justice. It was about ensuring that the man who had extorted his own son's lunch money would never have the opportunity to hurt another soul. As the trial date arrived, Smith stood in front of the mirror in his small bathroom. He didn't wear a fancy suit. He didn't have one. He wore his best work shirt, pressed and clean, and his face was shaved close. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who had survived 75% of his life in the shadows and had finally stepped into the light to protect what remained. He took Jason's hand as they walked toward the courthouse. The boy was nervous, but he walked with a steady stride. They weren't just going to a trial. They were going to reclaim their names. Smith looked at the massive stone pillars of the court building and felt a sense of peace. He had spent 7 years cleaning the city's debris, but today, he was going to help remove the most significant piece of trash he had ever encountered. As they entered the courtroom, Smith saw Peter sitting at the defense table. The expensive jacket was gone, replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit. The ghost looked smaller, paler, and stripped of the arrogant swagger that had defined him in the alley. Peter looked at Smith, his eyes pleading for a mercy he hadn't earned. Smith didn't look away, but he didn't offer a smile. He simply sat down in the witness box, placed his calloused hands on the railing, and prepared to tell the truth for the boy who sat in the front row, watching with a quiet, fierce pride. The janitor was done with the shadows. The trial was finally here, and Smith was ready to wash it all away. The courtroom was a vast, echoing chamber of marble and mahogany, a place where the messy truths of the city were finally distilled into cold, legal facts. Smith sat in the witness box, his back straighter than it had been in years. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh, reminiscent of the subway platforms he had scrubbed for thousands of nights. But here, they didn't illuminate grime. They illuminated the truth. He looked out at the gallery and saw Jason sitting in the front row. The boy looked small in the oversized wooden pew, but his eyes were fixed on Smith with an unwavering intensity that gave the old man a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Across the room, Peter looked like a hollowed-out version of the man from the alley. Without the tailored coats and the expensive cologne, he was nothing more than a frightened man in an orange jumpsuit, his hands trembling as they rested on the defense table. Every time Peter tried to catch Smith's eye, Smith looked through him as if he were truly the ghost he had pretended to be for 7 years. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice as sharp and efficient as a scalpel, led Smith through the narrative of his life since the accident. Smith spoke slowly, his gravelly voice filling the silent room. He described the midnight shifts, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the meticulous way he had saved every penny for Jason's future, believing he was the boy's only hope. He told the court about the insurance money he had used to bury an empty casket and the 7 years of labor he had endured to provide the best of everything for a child whose father had abandoned him for a life of luxury uptown. When it came time to describe the confrontation in the alley, Smith didn't falter. He recounted the sight of his son extorting lunch money from a 10-year-old boy, using fear and lies to bleed his own family dry. The courtroom remained breathless as Smith described the moment the ghost was revealed to be a predator. Peter's attorney tried to paint a picture of a man overwhelmed by debt and desperation, but Smith's testimony made it clear. Peter had chosen the shadows not out of necessity, but out of a profound and selfish disregard for those who loved him. After hours of testimony, the judge, a man who looked as though he had seen the worst of humanity, called for a recess. Smith stepped down from the witness box, his joints aching but his spirit light. He walked over to Jason and pulled the boy into a tight embrace. "Is it over, Grandpa?" Jason whispered into his chest. "The hard part is, son," Smith replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Now we just wait for the light to finish its work." The verdict came swiftly the following morning. Peter was found guilty on all counts of grand larceny, insurance fraud, and several other financial crimes that had come to light during the investigation. As the judge read the sentence, 10 years in a state penitentiary with no possibility of early parole, Smith felt no surge of triumph. He felt only a profound sense of relief. The parasite was gone. The secret that had threatened to suffocate his grandson had been burned away by the legal system. As the bailiffs led Peter away, the younger man stopped and turned toward Smith one last time. For a second, Smith saw a flash of the boy Peter used to be, the son who had promised to make the family proud. But then the mask of resentment returned, and Peter was led through the heavy steel doors, leaving the courtroom and their lives forever. Outside the courthouse, the city was as loud and indifferent as ever. Commuters rushed toward the subway, and cars honked in the midday traffic. But as Smith and Jason stood on the stone steps, the air felt different. It was crisp and clear, devoid of the chemical smell of the tunnels or the stale smoke of the alley. "What do we do now, Grandpa?" Jason asked, looking up at the skyscrapers. Smith looked at his hands. They were still calloused and stained, but they no longer felt like the hands of a martyr. They felt like the hands of a man who had finally finished the longest, hardest shift of his life. "We go home, Jason," Smith said. "And then, I think I'm going to take a long sleep. And when I wake up, we're going to figure out what you want to be. Not what I want for you, but what you want." In the weeks that followed, the apartment began to change. The janitor's jumpsuit was retired to a box in the back of the closet. Smith didn't stop working. He couldn't afford to retire completely, but he moved to a day shift at a local library, where he spent his hours among books and quiet scholars instead of the dark, screeching tunnels of the subway. It was a quieter life, one that allowed him to be home every evening for dinner with Jason. The insurance company, moved by the unique circumstances of the case and Smith's integrity, had waived their right to pursue him for the initial payout, focusing their recovery efforts on Peter's hidden assets uptown. This allowed Smith and Jason to stay in their apartment, no longer haunted by the fear of a debt they couldn't pay. They spent their weekends in the community garden. The tomatoes they had planted together were finally ripening, heavy and red on the vines. Jason had become the garden's unofficial caretaker, his once fearful eyes now bright with the simple joy of watching something grow. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jason turned to Smith. "Do you think he'll ever change, Grandpa?" "My dad." Smith looked at the marigolds they had planted, their bright orange petals a stark contrast to the gray city around them. "I don't know, Jason. Some people are like weeds. No matter how much you try to change them, they always want to take over. But we're not weeds. We're the ones who plant the garden." Smith realized then that the best of everything wasn't a destination or a material possession. It was the ability to stand in the sun with a clear conscience. It was the strength to choose the truth when a lie was easier. He had spent 7 years cleaning up a lie, but in doing so, he had forged a grandson who was stronger, kinder, and more honest than the man who had abandoned them. As they walked back to their apartment, Jason chattering about his new art project and the book he was reading, Smith felt a sense of peace that had been absent since the day he first held that 3-year-old boy's hand at a funeral. He was 65 years old, a man of modest means and calloused hands, but as he climbed the stairs to their home, he knew he was the wealthiest man in the city. He had saved his family from the shadows, and finally, the fortress was complete. The janitor had finished his work, and the home was clean.